Every year since 1989, the Library of Congress has selected 25 films to add to the National Film Registry. The criteria? The films must be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Each week on You're Missing Out, we take a look at one of these films to try and get to the heart of why they were selected and why they still matter.
This week, it's the Season 5 premiere. We're kicking off the 1993 induction year with Phil Iscove, returning to the show to discuss Blade Runner.
Our guest today is the writer, producer, and co-creator of Sleepy Hollow and the co-host of podcast Like It's, Phil Iscove. Oh, you know what? No, to honor the film we're talking about today, let me try that again. Okay. Writer, producer, co-creator of Sleepy Hollow, and co-host of podcast Like It's, Phil Iscove joins us today to talk about Blade Runner.
Is that your Harrison Ford?
That is Harrison Ford at gunpoint recording his voiceover.
Okay.
Because
like
to make sure people know up top, we are talking about the theatrical cut today.
I watched the final cut, but I also watched the bits of the. It's fine.
It's totally fine.
I think to also honor Phil's show from the rain-drenched streets of Los Angeles and the far-flung future of 2019. Remember when 2019 was the far-flung future and not?
It wasn't even that far in the 80s. Is the thing too? Like it's.
I know it's
anyway.
Weird. I mean, we're here to talk about Blade Runner with Phil Iscove.
Guys,
you haven't gotten to
how you doing, bud?
No. Yeah.
Thank you for having me, guys.
Phil,
as always, I am honored to open a new season.
Thank you for coming back. I'm sorry we didn't have a movie with a brassy broad leading the charge, but
there are brassy broads in this movie,
and not just that. Here's the thing, Tom. We should acknowledge a couple things. Number one, release order wise, Phil is the first ever member of our own Five Timers Club.
Oh wow,
so that's worth noting.
That's crazy, but okay.
And second, by sheer accident, you've continued your trend of setting up double features. And by that I mean, in our very first season, you did Sunset Boulevard. Season 2, All About Eve. Co-Best Picture nominees about falling stars.
Sure.
Okay. Then, our third season, you did Chinatown.
I did.
And our fourth, you did Double Indemnity, doubling up on the California film noir. Now, people might be going, what do you mean, Mike? This is season 5. How could he do a double feature? Well, there's a movie that we have had reserved for Phil in season 6 since we started the show, and Phil, accidentally created a double feature because between Blade Runner and next season's E.T. the Extraterrestrial, you accidentally created a 1982 science fiction double feature for yourself.
Hell yeah.
It's kind of impressive how this keeps happening.
I'm completely accidental.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that, and we'll talk about this, but like, this movie's got some serious noir vibes too, obviously.
Oh, does it? Does it just a teensy bit? Just a little bit.
But I truly, watching this again, like, I have a weird history with this movie, quite honestly.
I think everyone does, honestly. It's because its own history is weird, so everybody has a weird history with it.
So, as you guys know, I worked at a video store, several video stores as I was growing up in Toronto, and this was a movie that I just couldn't seem to really fuck with for a long time. It just felt inaccessible to my brain. I couldn't lock into it. I also don't think I'm alone. This movie has, I think that it has sort of a weird history. I think there are people that just like got it right out of the gate. And then I think there's some people that are kind of like, what's going on? But its vibe didn't make sense to me and I couldn't just get it. And then some switch got flipped for me. I want to say like, I don't know, in my probably late teens, when all of a sudden I was like, oh, okay, now I get this thing. But I got to say, watching it yesterday might have been my most enjoyable watch yet, which I think says something. I don't know.
You know what I think might be a big problem with this movie and its ability for people to connect to it over the years, and how I feel like it's getting easier. This is not a movie made for VHS or even DVD. It's because this is such a vibes, visual, like heavy movie. If you're watching this cropped on a VHS and you're losing a lot of what Ridley and the team of miniature artists and whatnot that made this movie, you're losing so much of the juice because a lot like the story, which has, no real consistent through line through the 5 different edits of it, and this edit of it doesn't have any of the Deckard's or replicant stuff. This one does. This one says maybe he is, maybe he isn't. And you go, well, what are we doing here, Rid? Can you maybe just make things a little clearer?
The idea of seeing this in pan and scan, honestly,
nightmare.
makes me want to fucking
I mean, here's what I'll say, because I think this is the time I should counter all of this, insofar as, well, no, because you were just saying well, I had a hard time latching onto it, and my experience with Blade Runner, because I saw this, since I was a kid, right? My dad was a huge sci-fi nut and loved Harrison Ford, so of course I saw it a lot. However, my experience with it was I remember watching it on a tape that was just the theatrical cut. Now, the director's cut existed by this point. Yeah. It's released in the 90s. But I remember watching it on tape and seeing the theatrical cut, not knowing the difference. And then finding out later and I loved it from the jump. This I really enjoyed this film. I really locked into it. Sure. And it didn't, I was not confused by this at all. And then because the thing I remember is a friend of mine, a guy I used to be very close friends with, Tom, met him a couple times. I remember him coming to me in middle school and going, I actually got the director's cut of Blade Runner, and this one's supposed to be good. And I had the feeling of I don't understand. What do you mean? It's one of the great movies. What do you mean this one's... Is it better? I missed it. And watching the director's cut without the voiceover and all of that Deckard's a replicant stuff, obviously, I clued into that. And I was able to see oh, this is a better version of the thing that I watched. But I never had this sense. I never grew up with this feeling of there's something off about OG Blade Runner. Now, why I think that might be for me, setting aside the pan and scan or anything like that, I think it's also the fact that Blade Runner, especially the original cut of Blade Runner, works if you are deeply immersed in science fiction, right? Because Blade Runner, it's not a movie that is interested in... I mean, the voiceover tries to explain things and make it a little more accessible, but no version of Blade Runner is terribly interested in kind of hand-holding you through sci-fi concepts, right? It has... Yeah?
Well, it's also breaking the mold of sci-fi. Well, I mean, you know what I mean?
At least to some degree. I mean, there's
to
Joe
Blow anyway.
It's breaking the mold of sci-fi in a major motion picture, right? Mm-hmm. But you have things like Neuromancer and things like that, or and things like that. But that's what I mean, right? What I mean by that is it's. I imagine it's not dissimilar to when Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings came out, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of people went to see that, and it was nothing you had seen on screen before, right? And it was hard fantasy. There was no point where a character popped up and went, let me explain to you what orcs are. It was just fucking, here it is. It's all here. We're doing this thing. And, But if you grew up reading fantasy literature and you grew up with that stuff, or you had all that stuff around you, you're yeah, I know what this is. I got all this stuff. And so I can understand because I remember my parents having this conversation where my dad... my mom hated Blade Runner, right? In fact, so much so that she now maintains she's never seen it, even though we all watched it together. Okay. But I remember it being a lot hang-up was that opening title card, where it's just walking you through, okay, so there were the Nexus 6 model of replicant, and these replicants rebelled, and it's not called, exterminating, it's called retirement. And my dad, who is a sci-fi nerd, was yeah, I got it. I get it. And my mom, throughout the whole movie, is going, wait, so... they're robots, but they're bleeding. Why are the robots? So it's I do think there's an element, especially for the 80s when we're, most people's sci-fi diet is, I went to see the Star Warses and a couple other things. 82 is a big year for sci-fi. But
Sure.
I do think there's that element too of it is a movie that isn't interested in sending Alice down the rabbit hole. Right, it just drops you into Wonderland and goes, "You're gonna figure it out."
Yeah, But I mean, yes, for sure. But there's also a little bit of putting the sci-fi aside for a second, just on a sort of archetypes and character level, it's, you know, it's very dreamlike. It's not really holding your hand on what Deckard's mission is necessarily. I mean, it is sort of, you know, he's there. There's 4 fucking, you know, replicants out there, and he needs to take them down, right? Like that. That is on a base level what it is. But then you have sort of these large swaths of sort of moments where you're just like hanging out with, you know, JF and Pris, and you're just, you know what I mean? Like there's just, it's got this very languid kind of dreamlikey, just sort of sit back and take in the world vibe, which, you know, in 82 is a lot for people, right? Like, well, I would argue that, like, you look at like 2001, which is probably like, there's, you know, obviously a connection between them, but like 2001 story is crazy, right? Like the third act of that movie is just sort of like, just hang on and just kind of, you know, whatever. It's more of a visual poem thesis thing that he's doing. I'm just saying that, like, I do think this movie is more challenging outside of just the science fiction of it all.
Well, I also think, you know, in as 1982 kind of bore out, was that there was like Mike mentioned earlier, big sci-fi year for 1980, just big year in general. 1982 had a lot of great classic stuff.
Huge.
But E.T. was the biggest hit, and it kind of just clobbers Blade Runner and The Thing. And, you know,
Tron?
And what?
Tron.
And Tron. So, like, it really feels like they were trying to, like, Ridley and the studio were trying to, like, do to neo-noir, or like bring that 2001 sort of like thing that gritted up like he did in Alien, but 4 years later the world is just like, no, we want lighthearted sci-fi, we want Star Wars sci-fi, we want stuff that's not really going to be complicating our emotion or our moral sense of stuff, because narratively this is just a straight line. There are no surprises. As a noir, everyone fits into their roles, and just narratively there is no mystery. There's 4 replicants. Roy Batty wants to kill his creator for giving him only 4 years of life, and then we just watch things happen until the end.
Well,
and but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just what the movie's more interested in is the moral questions of humanity and what makes you human, and you know, that the robots are becoming more human than the humans, and the humans are becoming so like inhuman. Really, like the whole point of the movie is Harrison, you know, Deckard kind of waking up to the fact that that all of these replicants are going off and doing all these things and living in a life. And, you know, Roy Batty's line, the things I've seen with your eyes, you know, all you know, I saw this, you know, exploding, blah, blah, blah. It's like,
but
and then him falling in love with a
is also my question too. Like, a lot of his memories are just implanted in him.
Well, I think,
but then that's another thing.
Right?
The fact that the movie introduces the idea that maybe we don't actually even know what's really happening, because the characters may not know what's really happening. I don't love the Deckard, is he a replicant, is he not stuff, but throwing it into, you know, Sean Young's character or Rutger's character or any of this stuff, where you kind of have to question, well, what really is happening in this world that we just sort of like, well, now we're introducing memories, and you're like, all right, well then, is Rutger telling the truth about what's going on? Is he sort of like, and then you got all of the stuff with Edward James Olmos, and like, well, is he playing a game with Deckard? It's to sort of like I don't like this. There's a lot of like,
I think Gaff is maybe one of the most up and up people in this movie. Quite frankly, I think.
Well, I also think Gaff is a style icon.
Fucking best. His last outfit is unfucking paralleled.
Edward James Olmos is, as the kids say, filled to the brim with Riz in this movie.
100%.
I want to push back on one thing that Tom just suggested, which is saying that there's no mystery to the film or anything. I do think that there is an element to, when I was rewatching the theatrical cut, especially, right? I think it is very hard for us to watch this movie for the first time again. Insofar as the most famous dialogue in this film, some of the most famous dialogue in science fiction films, is that I've seen things you people wouldn't believe, attack ships, right? So we know that. And that is always going to color how you watch the movie going forward. That is the ultimate conclusion. Sitting down and watching the theatrical cut, you kind of forget how much of the movie it doesn't get into the idea of, well, Roy Batty is going after his creator to demand more life and to question why he's given a short life. The thing that's impressive about it is that the movie is, for 2/3, a noir riff that's just about, I gotta go kill robots that have gone rogue. And it's not until the last act where it shifts from noir to existentialism. And I think, while it's maybe not a mystery, the thing about it is, at least, again, in terms of theatrical cut, when you watch it the first time, it's this, because I watched it with somebody who had never seen it before. And it's this thing of like, she and I were talking about it afterward. The first thing she said when the movie ended, she goes, I see why you like this so much, because it's a robot that doesn't want to die. And it's just like, she's like, it's just existentialism. But it is the thing of like, the twist, the rug pull that this movie does is that you don't realize until you get to the third act that at no point have you wondered why the robots are killing, right? You're just like, they give you a little title card. Now, in the final cut, the title card is a little more explicit about like, well, there was a rebellion and XYZ, but like, you just go in, your brain just goes, right, robots gone rogue, we got to take out the robots, right? Like, I get it. He's got to go take out the robots. And the first twinge of something might be wrong is when M. Emmett Walsh shows up and goes, hey, you got to kill Sean Young too, right? That's the first time you go, okay, even though we've watched some brutal robot deaths at this point. But once Roy Batty is talking to, once Roy and Pris are talking to the toy maker, and he's like, essentially going, don't you think it's fucked up? They only gave us 4 years to live. That's fucked up, right? It's not until then that you, the viewer, are like, yeah, I guess I didn't really ask myself why they need to kill these robots. The movie told me they do, and we could kind of all just go, all right, that's your job, Rick. And once you watch it again, then you're starting to understand these things more. But initially, on first blush, like, there is that.
This watch for me, really, to your point, Mike, really sort of colored in and fleshed out, for lack of a better term, Roy's character. This time round, I genuinely felt for him in a way that I don't think I had ever sort of before. I think I always just sort of saw him as just a fucking bad guy. Like, he's our antagonist. And then by the end of the film, when it turns, as you mentioned, Mike, that sort of the conversation with Tyrell, right? The conversation where he's just like, I want more life, Father. Like, why did you do this? And Tyrell just being like, hey, man, them's the breaks. And then he's like, cool, I'm going to crush your skull. It does feel very sort of, I mean, listen, it's Roy saving Deckard at the end is obviously not subtle particularly, but there is sort of something lovely about him grabbing him with the hand that has been sort of defying him, if you will, that has the nail in him. There is something very sort of nice about it in the end, that Roy does find some level of humanity within him, even if it's in his final moments of life. But I don't know. The existentialism this time really hit me. And also, quite frankly, just I don't know that the plot ever really clicked for me as well as it did this time. Like, I think every time I've watched this film, I've just kind of let it wash over me and just kind of been like, it's just fucking rad getting to be in this world for 2 hours. Like, that in and of itself is just like fucking awesome. And I think because whenever I'm doing my podcast or I go on other people's podcasts, I'm just like really paying attention and just like giving it the strictest attention. This time I locked into like the actual puzzle pieces, if you will, of like how things are playing out. And it's a much cleaner movie than people give it credit for, right? Like, I don't actually think that it's to your initial point, Mike, particularly confusing. I think they've muddied the waters with all the different cuts. But like, if you
That's
just watch,
the biggest problem.
yeah, that's the thing.
That's the biggest problem, because I mean, Ridley tends to not understand why the good things he's made are good,
Yes.
as we've seen with his Alien prequels that are actually Blade Runner prequels.
No,
they're bad.
I ride for Covenant fucking rules.
No, it doesn't.
I-
You
I'll-
can ride him,
I
and
will-
you can
I
ride.
will-
You can ride him straight to hell.
I will pull a I will pull a little, like, I'm between you insofar as, Phil, I don't dislike those movies. That said, the thing I do find maddening when I watch Prometheus or Covenant, and he's clearly the most interested in the Fassbender character, is I remember seeing Covenant the first time. Tom and I both, like, we saw it roughly around the same time and walked out.
Because we were working at Alamo at the time.
Yeah, and our consensus was both like, Ridley, you clearly want to make Blade Runner movies. You are using Alien prequels to explore the themes that fascinated you in Blade Runner. Like, the idea of going into, I'm going to make
he didn't make Blade Runner
2049. Right. That's the thing that is, well, part of that, I think, if I may, part of that I will say is that I didn't realize until this, because I really dove into, I watched the 3.5 hour Dangerous Days.
Love that.
It's a great doc, but you really come to appreciate. So we'll talk about this real quick, and then we'll play the registry clip, and then we'll get into the deeper discussion. Okay. But it was interesting to discover that, like, Ridley got offered this movie, turned it down because he was going to go make Dune for Dino De Laurentiis. Meanwhile, the screenwriters are basically pulling everything sci-fi out of the Philip K. Dick novel that isn't, let's go shoot some robots. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot to pull out of that Philip K. Dick novel, because I also read the novel, and that is a mess. Sorry, folks. That book is weird. We'll talk about it. The whole thing that turns it around. Do you know this, Tom? Why Ridley ends up picking up Blade Runner?
I'm forgetting. I'm sure I've heard it at some point.
It sort of mirrors how Blade Runner flows, because we talked about how, like, the first chunk of it is just like, let's go shoot some robots, and then right toward the end, when they're about to move on, his older brother dies of cancer.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And Ridley is grappling with the cruelty of mortality and not understanding this and having all these struggles. And he reads the Blade Runner script again and locks in on, essentially, fine, I'll make your robot detective movie if the last act is going to be going, death is cruel and unfair, and it's fucked up that we all accept this. And that's how it becomes the movie that it is.
I mean, I don't know what Ridley's Dune looks like in 82. I mean, I just want to say this for what it's worth. This is one of the most beautiful looking movies ever fucking made. Full stop. Like, it is just a exquisite production that we are still seeing filmmakers chase to this day. Right?
I mean,
like, it is. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
Well, that alone is why it makes it like such a slam dunk note. Like, there's not even a discussion to be had about why it's in the registry. You go like, oh yeah, well, there hasn't been a more like chased after visually movie since Blade Runner. Like, that's the movie since 1982 that every sci-fi movie is trying to be.
You watch it in 2025, and you are still gobsmacked by how it looks.
Absolutely, yeah.
It is just a stupendous achievement, to the point where you're just like, if nothing else, you just get the impression that Ridley's like, well, I could do some cool shit here. Like, I could build a bunch of toys, and I can do something really exquisite. His Dune might have been great. Like, it might have been great. I don't know. But I also feel like I really liked Blade Runner 2049. There are a lot of people that didn't. I know that it didn't really hit in the way that everybody, or certainly the studio, had wanted it to. It was long. There were people that complained about it. I love it. I think it's great. Even fucking Ridley threw shade at it, which I'm just like, Ridley, can you just not be a dick for 5 seconds? But why didn't he make Blade Runner 2049? Like, what
well, the reason I wonder, and I know he's recut this a million times,
yeah,
but I do wonder if part of that is that because for him, this is so intricately tied to grieving his brother and coping with that.
Fair enough.
I do like, and I say this as somebody, look, I don't like Blade Runner 2049 very much personally. Despite the fact that I have the Blade Runner 2049 Johnny Walker bottle over here as decor for this episode.
It's no joke too.
But my thing with Blade Runner 2049 and any of this, and I say this even having, like I said, read the novel, is that the thing that makes Blade Runner work so well and work better than a lot of science fiction films is that there is a lot of thought that went into the world building that it doesn't show us and never explains.
Sure.
And so often the thing that screws up science fiction is when authors are like, I want to tell you why these things happen. I want to explain all of this. And it's never as good as being dropped in the middle of this world. The example I always go to with that, and I know this is a popular franchise, but like the thing that drives me nuts is as a kid, I loved watching Star Wars and hearing things like, I made the Kessel Run in 12 parsecs. And that's just a line that's tossed off and you go, what the fuck could that be? This world is cool. They've got made up metrics and stuff. Or, well, the Clone Wars.
Don't worry, they'll explain it all eventually.
That's my point. So when I was a kid, nothing was better than like you were on your living room floor with your figurines, like trying to imagine what the Clone Wars are. Nothing's as satisfying. Reading the Philip K. Dick novel, where he's like, and of course, in the world of do androids dream of electric sheep? Let me explain to you why exactly all of these people act this way. You see, there's a machine that they get feelings from, that a Jesus figure is inside, but that Jesus figure is really a metaphor for television. And it's just like, it's so much of that. And Blade Runner only works, to me, if you don't touch it after that movie, right? Because even the elements of like, and I know you guys said you're less on the, is Deckard a replicant or not, but clearly Ridley finds that very interesting of the, is Deckard a replicant or not? Let's be ambiguous here. Well, the minute you sequelize this, it becomes a lot harder to keep that mystery. The same thing of like, for me, when I saw 2049, and there's like this subplot introduced of like, well, a lot of us replicants are going to rebel. There's an underground group of replicant rebels. And I'm like, I understand why you think you can do that. And I understand why somebody who watched Blade Runner would be like, wouldn't that be a cool idea? But the beauty of the original Blade Runner is all of this stuff could be going on in the periphery, but it's not as interesting to depict any of it. Whereas Blade Runner works because you're telling a small, singular story within this larger world. And I think Ridley, he doesn't want to touch it.
I think I just got to say, completely disagree with everything.
I know
you
do.
I think everything in Blade Runner 2049 works completely. I think they kind of magically get around the is a Deckard a replicant or not thing because it's not really important anymore. If he's a replicant, then he's clearly a new kind that helped impregnate another replicant. We know Sean Young's a replicant, so there's the question. I was already like, well, it's not important because this is the big question here. I think all the world building stuff is great. I think it still manages to be very focused on a singular story while exploring the world. It's just so weird that Ridley didn't choose to do it because if it's so tied to grief, not to be crass about it, he lost another brother like 9 years before 2049 came out, and he's clearly working himself to the bone to not deal with the fact that his brother Tony died after Unstoppable. Like, that's something that's clear. I mean, The Counselor is all about that. There's a reason why the Alien prequels are all about mortality and why Fassbender's character is his central and only interesting element in those movies. It's clearly so. And he said since 2049's come out, it's like, I really regret not making it. It's like, well then, I mean, thank God you didn't. You would have ruined it. But also, like, well then, why didn't you? It's just weird for him to just have, especially so it's not like he doesn't work. He works all the goddamn time. I'm sure he could have squeezed it in between his schedule of making House of Poopy and Gladiator 2.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it seems as though, I mean, listen, who knows the real? But like, Ridley definitely was attached to 2049 for quite some time. Now, my assumption is that the development process was not seamless since he's a persnickety individual. And at a certain point, they probably, either couldn't see eye to eye on where they wanted the movie to go, or the studio was just like, we're moving forward with this, and we've had enough of your nonsense. I also just think, I hear what you're saying, Mike. I really do. And I do think that one of the wonderful things about the original Blade Runner is that it doesn't over-explain itself. That it just throws you into this world and says, like, just sink or swim. I would argue that Blade Runner 2049 does something pretty similar as well, which is that it's not really holding your hand either. I think there's a lot of people, my guess is an entire generation, that sat down and watched 2049 having not seen the first Blade Runner, which I wouldn't recommend, but I imagine that people did that. And it probably felt similar to them as the people that watched this original film in 82, where they were just like, I don't know what's going on.
Well, but here's what I would say to that, and then we will get to the rest of it. I think it's different insofar as we're in a different world now, right?
Okay.
In terms of like, well, no, I mean, like, the language and the, we talk about this all the time with just movie-going audiences in general, be it like science fiction or superhero movies, right? Like when you watch a comic book movie from, whether the 1980s or anything like that, or even like the early 2000s, where they feel like they need to sit down and very carefully go, so the X-Men, they're mutants. They wear special suits and go fight. And now you can kind of just go, yeah, there's Spider-Man. You know what Spider-Man is. You know how this shit works. Basic sci-fi concepts that were so foreign to audiences 20, 30 years ago have saturated the mainstream a lot more, so that now the idea of, well, a robot, what is humanity? Can a robot yearn to be human? Like, we've had so much stuff dealing with that now. We've had so much material that I'm not saying that the generation that sat down to watch 2049 watched 9 seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation with data on it. But I am saying they're living in a world where we've had data. We've had so many characters in the mainstream that are robots trying to be human. Whereas when you go to 82 with Blade Runner coming out, that's not the sci-fi culture, and these kind of tropes of science fiction aren't anywhere near the mainstream like they are now.
Can I just say one quick thing before obviously we get more into the original, but I just want to say that for me, 2049 is worthwhile because I think it's Harrison giving one of the best performances he's ever given. I think that Harrison Ford, who notoriously spoke ill of Blade Runner for many, many, many years and was just like, I didn't really get it. It didn't really make sense to me. Audiences didn't really like it, blah, blah, blah. Makes a sequel to this movie and gives one of the most full-throated and human performance. The scene where he sees Rachel in 2049 is incredible. He is fucking giving it in a way that I genuinely think he has not in many, many, many years.
Well, I think ultimately the reason 2049 didn't succeed is that it's a 40-year later sequel to a sci-fi movie that people didn't see when it came out and only freaks like us like to watch. It's just that simple. That's fair. The 2010s were littered with like 20, 30-year later sequels that didn't succeed, and studios just didn't learn their lesson. And this time they're like, well, maybe Denis Villeneuve will be the one to crack the code. And you go, no, it's still Blade Runner. Also, normies don't like this stuff.
It's also 2 hours and 45 minutes.
And we forget that came out because I think people have memory hold a lot of this. And I'm going to bring this up because it's part of why I still have this attitude of Blade Runner should be untouched, is that it's not just Blade Runner 2049. We kind of remember it being that way because that was that was the major theatrical film, but this was part of a blitz of, there was Blade Runner 2049, then there was the online content of Blade Runner Nexus Dawn, then there was the anime series on Adult Swim right after called Blade Runner Black Lotus, and we're doing Blade Runner graphic novels, and this was a part of a massive push of like, can we make Blade Runner into a franchise? And absolutely,
wasn't this the first thing of that wave?
So what they had done with 2049 is that they were anticipating making it like a multimedia thing. So prior to the release of 2049, they created a series of short films that were web content that were like, let's fill in the gaps between Blade Runner. Some of them were live action, some of them were animated. Then we're going to release graphic novels that are tie-ins within the world of Blade Runner. This was like when Blade Runner 2049 came out, they were talking about like the world of Blade Runner the same way they were saying Dark Universe when The Mummy was coming out, right? And what happened...
I get that.
And I'm not saying that to be dismissive, but I am saying, to rewind to 2018, 2019? When did 20?
I believe it was 2018.
2018 is that now, because the film was well respected and got a bunch of Oscar even though it bombed, because it was well respected and got a bunch of Oscar nominations, and Denis Villeneuve has gone on to become, everybody's blockbuster auteur now. It's hard to remember that, like, when this was coming out, it did kind of feel a little bit like yet another studio going like, we have IP, we could do an IP thing. Remember our IP, Blade Runner? That. So there was a lot more of like trying to make it into. I think there was like even an MMO online, maybe. I don't know if this is true. I
think fundamentally, what was learned about Blade Runner, unlike something like Dune, for instance, just on the Villeneuve of it all, Dune is a series of books that are pretty beloved, even though a lot of people think they drop off pretty significantly. It was a long gestated project that had been trying to get off the ground for years, and Villeneuve cracked it. I mean, it helps when you have like the hottest cast in the world, but still, like, I guess what I'm getting at is it's not crazy that they did this, right? It didn't hit because it was long. It didn't hit because everything that you're talking about, Mike, but then Dune does. So, which does kind of prove that.
Well, it's also a little different. I think it's a little different because this is directly a sequel. You have to have watched an other movie that didn't connect and doesn't really have the same normie, cachet. Where Dune, it's been tried a while. They did the Lynch version, blah blah blah, all the books, blah blah. But a normie can come into Dune fresh.
Theoretically, yes. Yeah.
You can just go into Dune and just let it happen, and you're like, okay, I want to see what happens in the next one.
You're right.
I think it's ultimately just the thing that Hollywood hasn't learned, and probably will never learn. You don't just make a sequel like 30, 40 years later to a movie that didn't succeed when it happened. Tron Legacy, they did the same thing with Tron Legacy, and they're making another Tron almost 20 years after Tron Legacy.
Tron Legacy rules.
All right.
Tron Legacy rules, but that's kind of like besides the point of like
we need to steer the ship back to talking about the actual movie we're here to talk about. Before we talk somewhat about Blade Runner, let's hear what the National Film Registry had to say. Here's what the Library of Congress said about Blade Runner.
Blade Runner. A blend of science fiction and film noir, Blade Runner was a box office and critical flop when first released, but its unique postmodern production design became hugely influential within the sci-fi genre, and the film gained a significant cult following that has increased its stature. Harrison Ford stars as Rick Deckard, a retired cop in Los Angeles circa 2019. LA has become a pan-cultural dystopia of corporate advertising, pollution, and flying automobiles, as well as replicants, human-like androids with short lifespans built for use in dangerous off-world colonization. Deckard, a one-time Blade Runner, a detective that hunts down rogue replicants, is forced back into active duty to assassinate a band of rogues out to attack Earth. Along the way, he encounters Sean Young, a replicant who's unaware of her true identity and faces a violent confrontation atop a skyscraper high above the city.
So that's what they said about Blade Runner. Now, we should note, the year it gets inducted is the class of 1993. If you're wondering why, an element has to be the fact that director's cut comes out the year before.
Yeah.
Right? And now the director's cut, or at least like the Ridley cut of Blade Runner, is something that was known about in film circles for quite a time at this point. I know, again, I talked to my father, like people had seen the work print. The famous work print cut of Blade Runner was a thing that it hadn't been officially released, but it was a big thing where if you went to sci-fi conventions, somebody was either like, hey, if you go to Hall A, we're screening this thing. We're not supposed to be, but we're running it. Or people had bootleg VHS tapes of it. And you were watching a work print on a bootleg VHS. So you barely make out what the fuck you were seeing, right? I think one anecdote I heard from somebody at a comic shop once was watching a work print as a younger person, with a VHS, and thinking somebody had just spliced in video of a unicorn as a giggle. Because it's just like, because you can't tell what the hell is going on. But that director's cut really reestablished Blade Runner, and I think is one of the, I'm not going to say it's the first, but at least in our modern culture, it's one of the first cases of something I think we're all a little more used to now in the home video era, which is this idea of like, yeah, that movie flopped, but there's a secret good version. I mean, the one that was like maybe
it's
most
also something Ridley can't let go of.
Well, yeah, but at the time we didn't know that. We didn't
Yes.
At the time we didn't anticipate that there were going to be 17. I mean, there's stuff over my shoulder here that came in the fabulous final cut.
Hell yeah,
sir!
Yeah.
Sold in the briefcase with everything for the Voight Comp test. This is my father's. He let me borrow it for this, but was legitimately very paranoid about its safety. He was like,
I do think too, to your point, Mike, it's and again, having worked in video stores, the director's cuts, this breaks the seal on that, right? Like that, then you have sort of a plethora of director's cuts, or at the very least, special editions of movies with deleted scenes and various things like that, in order to and Ridley himself continually putting out director's cuts of other movies that he's made that he just can't let go of.
Well, Kingdom of Heaven is that like perfect example.
Is better.
Yeah,
is a better
absolutely.
version of it. It is interesting how, and now obviously we live in a post Snyder Cut world, for good or bad. I do think that it is interesting. You make a really good point of like, it gave this a second life that it certainly didn't have in the first.
Well, because at this point, Ridley kind of wasn't making good movies. He kind of showed life again with Thelma and Louise, but then he's kind of in the weeds. And Blade Runner
100%.
is kind of just a thing that nerds like, but there's no real there's no juice to this movie. It's kind of just bubbling under the surface. And then with the home video market, this is obviously probably the most famous case, but there's also, he did it before with Alien.
Yep.
Cameron did one for Aliens. Cameron famously with Cameron did one for The Abyss. So like we're now in the early 90s with Laserdisc and Criterions and what forth. We're able to get an even deeper view into what the filmmaking process is like, that there could be a movie that comes out, and even if it's beloved in certain circles, you go, oh wait, this got massacred by a studio, by meddling interests. And you can now see, even though, let's be honest, Blade Runner never really cracked the code on what's the best cut of the movie, because good Christ, there's too many cuts of this movie.
Yeah.
You would like to say, oh, I wish they could take one more crack at it to make the actual best version, but I don't think that was ever going to happen, because it's not like this was an easy shoot, not just because of tensions between Harrison and Ridley, and Rutger and Ridley, and Sean Young being her own sort of wild card and everything, but just the studio not believing it, clearly being one of the most impressive technical feats in cinema, not an easy movie to make, all of this, and then it bombs and blah blah blah. So like,
I also think that you're seeing you see post Blade Runner director's cut and the various technologies you're talking about. Probably DVD was the one that really broke through. Laserdisc obviously didn't do as well, but when you actually had filmmakers that were trying to do like film school through their movies, right? Where you have your David Finchers and you have these filmmakers and Ridley that want to like show you the guts of how they made this fucking thing.
Yeah.
And just be like, we're going to give you everything. and just like give you a buffet of options. We don't see that as much anymore because obviously the video market is just not what it used to be. But like we still have criterions, and that's all fine and good. But like, I mean, even Fincher stopped doing it, which is just so depressing to me because he used to be the guy.
Well,
it's it's the weird thing of the home video market isn't dead. If anything, it might be more thriving than ever before in some regards. It's just you're not getting budgets to do special features.
But it's also the case I would counter, and I've brought this up on the show before, but like special features and making ofs now would be more boring. Insofar as like, I've brought this up before on other episodes, but like when in the 80s and 90s, right, you would watch those Spielberg making ofs, or you would go to like Universal Studios Orlando or Hollywood, where they'd be like, and now we're going to show you how we do green screen, and we're going to show you how we do sound effects, and we're going to show you how we do this. And there's so much like practical elements to it. And now so much of that, if you tried to open a Magic of the Movies experience now, you'd go, all right, let's show you how we made the sets. We push this button on a computer, and now and I think that I'm only saying that insofar as like there was so much when again watching Dangerous Days, right? And there's so much that they're just like, here, I'm going to show you like physical pages of concept art, and I'm going to show you us building these models and everything. That like that there was an interest. How much like even like my grandparents who didn't give a damn about like film history would watch those HBO first look things just because they were like, well, I couldn't believe they put that guy up on strings. I forget. I think it was like the Matrix first look where they were like, I don't want to see the Matrix, but I loved watching how they did it.
The flip side is I watched an 1.5-hour documentary on the making of Fincher's Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and I was rapt the entire time. I'm sorry, but
Dragon Tattoo was like almost 20 years ago now. But we're in a different industry.
But I think I disagree too, because Zack Snyder, you brought up the Justice League earlier, so I'm gonna that's maybe the Blade Runner of the 21st century, again, for better or worse. It's an infamous case, but Zack Snyder's movies for a while were some of the best Blu-rays that you could get, because he would do commentaries, and he wouldn't just do commentaries, he'd do picture-in-picture commentaries and basically talk you through the movie, and he was one of those guys that liked to explain how it was made. Zack Snyder's Justice League has a 4K set. There's no special features on it. And that is something I would genuinely love to see in-depth making ofs, not because we know how green screen and people flying is done, but I want to see what it's like to go into a movie that was essentially done, have to go in, crack it open again, and refit everything and shoot new scenes. And like, what is this whole process like? Napoleon sucked, but like, I kind of would like to, I wouldn't mind watching at least like a 30-minute special feature of Ridley talking about like, well, the decisions I made to cut Napoleon down from 3 hours to 2, whatever it was.
There's also the flip side to this, which we don't have to do a deep dive into this. I do hear where you're coming from, Mike. The lack of practicality when it comes to making movies of this scale has certainly receded. That goes without saying. But half of the juice for me when it comes to special features is not really about like seeing them build sets, as cool as that is. It really is about the interplay of the people. It's about seeing the direction, seeing how they, got to certain places with character, all that sort of stuff, costumes. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff that still really, really fascinates me about movie making. And I think that we're losing that somewhere.
Well, there's, again, this was for a movie 20 years ago, but for Rob Zombie's remake of Halloween, he put out a 4-hour documentary about the making of, and you would think, oh, well, that's too much, but it literally takes you beat by beat from writing it, pre-production, shooting, editing, and you're like, oh, right. The reason we like special features is to sort of like see what the process is like and how through such tumultuous circumstances. I mean, the guy made a movie for the Weinsteins. He survived something. There is something to be said of like when you watch, because we brought up Honora before we recorded. I'd like to see a making of Honora, like how we snuck around New York and shot a movie without permits. It almost feels like we're trying to not talk about the movie because I kind of said it before, but it's like this is kind of one of the most like, well, no duh movies we've done in a while.
I do have a lot to say about this movie.
I know you
since I was like 8 years old.
I know, but like there's so much, but there's just so much to talk about with the movie that's not actually about the movie, because at the end of the day, you kind of just go like, well, yeah, no duh, it's the most influential sci-fi movie of the last 40, 50 years.
Can I say something about this movie?
Please do.
Mike, that might open this up a little bit. But, you know, watching it this time, I was really sort of, obviously this thing is blending so many different genres together.
Mm-hmm.
The anime component really hit me this time.
Yeah.
You know, I was just sort of like, and imagining how groundbreaking that must have felt in its moment. Now we take it for granted, right? Like we take seeing Japanese characters and seeing all that sort of stuff, that the infusion of Japan in this Los Angeles is something that's so in its DNA and in its bones that we take for granted.
And it's so funny because it's great and I love it, and you love all that look and all of that and whatnot, but it's a I don't want to say a cynical thing that they're doing, but it's a thing of the time of the 80s where like there was such this fear of Japan overtaking America because its economy was booming and the technology industry and all of that. So like there was this fear in the 80s, Japan's going to take over. So what do they do in Blade Runner? What's the dark, horrible future look like where everything's bad and the world is sort of like on its edge? It's like, oh, Japan is sort of like infiltrated everything and technology is running wild. And
I wouldn't call it cynical. I don't see it.
It's not. That's the wrong word, but it's just a part of that dystopic story it's telling.
Sure. I mean, but this is the thing that I think is interesting, and again, with all the making of it, all the thought that went into this, right, is that one of the things that Blade Runner is doing, as opposed to the novel, is it's sort of overcorrecting for one of the things we have to deal with when it comes to science fiction is that from the, let's say, 30s, 40s, but especially like the 50s into the 60s and early 70s, there's a lot of great science fiction authors writing a lot of influential science fiction that is accidentally or intentionally kind of fascist and kind of reactionary and right wing, right?
Sure.
Just kind of like, again, you people are like, oh man, you got to read Stranger in a Strange Land, and you're like, oh, I think this is kind of, who loved that was Charles Manson. This is weird. There's some stuff in these books that people latch onto in a weird way. Again, people kind of forget Starship Troopers, the book, literal. So and even Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is like, it's definitely sexist. It's there's a lot of very kind of reactionary shit in it. And I think that what Blade Runner does kind of well is it is trying to one degree or another to introduce an element of multiculturalism into a story that otherwise seems to come from a place of like the future, with the whites. Like, again, to look at that Dick novel, God damn it. To look at that Philip K.
Every night for an hour.
To look at that, where you've got this issue of like even stuff in that book that surprises you. Like, so in the movie, Deckard says, he talks about his ex-wife, right? In the novel, Deckard is married and his wife is just a bitch. And that's like a narrative through line. And you might be saying, oh, well, he's married, so he doesn't have sex with Rachel? Of course he does. He absolutely cheats on his wife and says it's not cheating because she's a machine. There's a lot of weird shit in that book.
Listen, to be fair, I get that argument. I'm just saying.
It's not. I mean, it's kind of a solid argument.
By the way, I'm just going to put this out there because there's no good time to point it out. You might hear the title, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and think, that's a fun pun. You would be shocked at how much of that novel is about literal electric sheep.
Cool.
Like pages upon pages of Deckard going, one of my electric sheep broke down in the yard.
So
I'm gonna have to get a replacement. You're like, what?
So you're saying that Dick book is too girthy?
So, but to bring up, like, I I don't, Tom, like, I don't disagree with you on, like, overall in the 80s, there was this, like, fear of Asia, but there was also this embrace of this new culture, this new element of, like, oh, this is some, you know, they've got hip, cool shit. Now, to Phil's point about the anime of it all, too, I think this is important in terms of, like, again, this thing I was talking about of audiences today are so different than audiences of 40 years ago, right?
This is like a Rosetta Stone movie.
You could, today, if you put out Blade Runner, anime is such a part of the culture that it doesn't matter if you don't personally watch it. The language, the visual language of anime is so well known to you, right? Like, the idea of the Akira slide is in like 5 million different things, right? Or even, like, to take it back to, you know, back in the pandemic when I first did Phil's podcast talking about Pokemon the movie. And it was like, when Pokemon the movie came out, like, there's so many things that are making fun of the Pokemon craze that you look at now and you're like, first of all, this is lazy. And second, like, what is this, dude? Like, is your only joke like this cartoon is from Asia? Now we all know it. It's even if you don't watch it, it's part of our DNA. Science fiction is kind of the same way in terms of, like, there's a huge difference between people our age and people now and, like, my parents or even my grandparents, and their relationship to that or their understanding of that. Sure. And yes, I think without Blade Runner, you know, it's an interesting thing where it kind of feeds off of each other, because Phil, you're saying, well, you know, the anime influence on Blade Runner, right? Mm-hmm. But what's so fascinating is after Blade Runner, how much anime is deeply indebted to, it's so funny.
It's a real Ouroboros.
It is.
Situation.
It's kind of. It's like that thing where, like, when American westerns were riffing on spaghetti westerns. It's like when you watch Cowboy Bebop, you're watching a bunch of guys who watched Blade Runner, which was a bunch of guys who were like, "Have you seen Tobar the Eighth Man? You remember Astro Boy? That was pretty dope." It's like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Which is great because you know Ridley absolutely had no tolerance for anime whatsoever. And it was just all of his production designers and all the, you know, the nerds that worked for him just being like, "Oh yeah, make the movie look cool."
See, okay. Here's the only thing I disagree with on that is that I can imagine Ridley Scott sitting down when somebody explains Astro Boy to him and going, "So you're telling me the man loses his son, dies, and he builds a machine to be like, tell me all about it. I can't watch it. It's cartoon bullshit, but tell me all about this."
Well, that's what I mean. Like, he would just be like, "Oh yeah, all those ideas are cool. I'm never gonna watch it. Nerds, do that."
I mean, I really do think that. I mean, there is kind of. Obviously, there's a geographical proximity in terms of Los Angeles to Tokyo in Japan, right? In terms of sort of immigration and that sort of element of it, which I think is part of this to some degree as well. To sort of your point, Tom, of like fear of the other and like what's coming for us culturally and technologically and whatnot, which I do think is very much there. I also just think, to our point a moment ago, it just looks fucking awesome.
Mm-hmm.
There's just
it looks cool.
Visually really cool about it.
It looks cool. It looks tangible, which is, you know, I'm not one of those guys that gets all up in arms about using CGI for stuff because, you know, Dune, Blade Runner 2049, a lot of stuff. You use CGI, and Ridley, he loves using CGI. Sometimes it works, sometimes blah, blah, blah. But there is something about this movie where it's like all of that like miniature and matte painting and all of that technology sort of just peaked. This was probably like the best use of all of that stuff because
you could wide shots in this movie that are gobsmacking.
It's
like at the end when all the stuff with him on the roof, like when he's dangling.
This is one of those like reference discs you could use for like a 4K player. Like I have the 4K of the Final Cut, and it's like it's out of control. It's one of those great 4K discs where it looks like it was shot on film, but it like is very clean. So like you just watch it and you just go like, Jesus fucking Christ! Like this was made in 1982, and like. Yeah, it was probably high budget for the day, but if you did like the 2025 budget equivalent, it would probably be like almost kind of like what Gareth Edwards did on The Creator, where you go like, that only cost $80 million? And you're like, what the fuck,
I
bro?
also just think it's worth noting, watching it this time, I was really paying attention to the LA of it all, in terms of like the locations of when, there's that beautiful kind of it's outside JF's apartment, and it's looking out on downtown LA, which is just looking grimy as all hell, and it's got this amazing marquee, and it's that shit. JF's apartment, the interior of it, that old downtown sort of wrought iron, all that stuff, and then the tunnel shot with the reflection of all the lights in it, which is I believe sort of like on your way to Pasadena. Like there's just the choices of real locations and how to make that look quote unquote futuristic and also old school at the same time. I mean, all of JF's apartment, this like Victorian kind of infusion with a bunch of fucking terrifying toys running around, like all that shit just looks
it's
immaculate.
it's the absolute next step of Ridley's filmography from Alien to this, of like, that was the real big like thing that he brought to Alien, because I read the Making of Alien book, and that's a book that pretty much says it's a movie that's three guys are responsible for that movie: Ridley, Walter Hill, and Dan O'Bannon. Because Dan O'Bannon came up with the structure of it and blah blah blah. Walter Hill came in and said, take out all of this crazy sci-fi shit, make them space truckers. And Ridley came in and said, I like what they did on Star Wars, where it looks dirty and everything's been used and grimy and grungy to give it a reality.
But then H.R. Geiger's a pretty big part of that too.
Four people. Four people. Well, I'm not counting H.R. Geiger as a person. He is an entity that just existed upon Earth for a few decades and then just went back to his home planet.
Fair. That's fair.
But like, so it's that natural next step of what Ridley really did get, and he completely forgot on the prequels. Which again, don't hate him. I think he misunderstands them, but he cleans them up too much in the prequels. But
I also think
it just feels so real for as quote unquote silly as this stuff is. Which my dad is around the same age as Mike's dad. He's of that generation where a lot of guys weren't like Mike's dad, where they couldn't get into this stuff because they didn't have. I don't want to be mean about it, but I say it to his face, so whatever. I'm like, you just don't have like the imagination to watch stuff that's not real. And seeing something like this must have been like, at least for some people,
your head wide open,
because it's like
really just
it's just so like that perfect level of futuristic, but you can see how we might actually get there. Now, clearly we didn't get there. The only thing that the Japanese have taken over in America is the LA Dodgers, but
can I also just say, to your point, Tom, that like Deckard's apartment, the interior of Deckard's apartment feels incredibly lived in. It feels kind of grimy. It feels kind of dirty. It feels like a person lives there.
Oh yeah.
And to your point, Tom, it's as though this world is livable, right?
Yeah,
like
you could just walk around
inside it.
You could just walk around a corner and see another story, which is like a point Mike was making before about the Star Wars stuff, where there would just be lines or the characters, and you could make toys about all the characters and whatever, but you didn't have to explain everything. You could just look and be like, oh, if Deckard's going down this way to chase what's her name, the one with the snake?
Zora.
Zora is like, oh, he's going to chase Zora. I'm going to go down this way, and something is probably pretty cool is happening down this way. And for the lived-in stuff, oh, God, I think it's one of my ultimate dreams to just be in, like, futuristic LA when it's raining and just getting drunk and just eating noodles on the street.
You brought up Zora, so I need to just shout out Joanna Casti, who, between this and Who Framed Roger Rabbit and 6 Feet Under, is just, like, an all-timer for me. She's so fucking cool, and her death in this, more slow motion, more panes of glass, more neon lights.
The panes of glass is so it's so goddamn funny. It's like, all right, Zora, where are you running? Because everything in front of you is plate glass. It's like a bit in like a Naked Gun movie or something.
It is.
Where it's just like, oh, we gotta walk through with a
You're just like, what are we doing?
Well, this is the thing. Here's the thing with Blade Runner is that
it's like in Wayne's World 2. Oh, we're walking through with this giant crate of eggs.
Totally,
well, why are you doing it? Well, what do you mean? That's what we're supposed to do.
this thing. There's points in Blade Runner. I'm not saying the movie's a comedy, but there are points in Blade Runner that are at least somewhat intentionally comedic. Because right around that time, another bit that does make me laugh.
Mm-hmm.
We're in a future world, right?
Yes.
We are in a dystopian future. Almost nothing is as it seems. The food doesn't look like our food, right?
Yeah.
Nothing of our world has survived.
Mm-hmm.
Except Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna is still around. And looks exactly like it looked before.
Correct.
There is
Correct.
no... that, I don't... Like, this time around watching it, that did just kill me. And you mentioned like the Zucker brothers Naked Gun, the airplane bit of the Hare. Like it did make me laugh this time around to realize like, right, nothing else still exists from our time.
Yeah,
except
it is
Hare
pretty
Krishna.
interesting how like, I mean, just speaking of Zora, I love also just, it needs to be shouted out. Her clear raincoat is just incredible. Just wearing just basically like
a shower
plastic.
curtain.
It's a shower curtain.
Yeah.
It's perfect. But like the moment when Decker is in his apartment and he puts the photo into whatever and he does the whole enhance
Mm-hmm.
thing. Like that was pretty state of the art back then, right? That idea of being able to zoom in on photos. This movie is trend setting technologically to some degree. I don't know. There is stuff in this movie that is silly for sure. Like for instance, I don't need to interview Rachel to know she's a fucking replicant. Like she's acting like a robot.
Well, now here's
Her
what I will
eyes
say.
are glowing.
Here's what I will say in not defense of that, but what I will say is this is one thing, and again, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? I don't love that novel, but an element of that novel is that he goes way hard into the idea of human beings now don't have emotions, right? In order to feel emotions, you receive emotions. There's a box in your home where you receive messages from, I don't know, I forget the character, but like he's some like cyber Jesus or whatever, and he's their version of religion, right? And Deckard's wife, one time Deckard comes home and she's in a good mood and he's like, why are you so happy? And she goes, I connected to the box early. And like, you're supposed to. So in the novel,
sounds like it sucks.
I know it's well respected, but like, it's very, did you ever see that bit, Phil? It was a Family Guy bit of like, and we now return to every sci-fi film of the 70s. And it's just a guy going, we must defeat the corporation. Oh no, I am part of the corporation. I am a machine. I must kill myself. No, like it's that. That's the novel.
Okay.
Great. Anyway, in the novel though, the idea is like humans have so taken away the ability to feel anything that when you're doing the Voight-Kampff test, it's that the whole thing is human beings have like this tiny reaction within their eyes to tragic things, right? And that's the only way to tell the difference between a human and a machine anymore, because all human reaction has boiled down to like, oh, your eye twitched a little bit when you heard an animal was murdered, right? Now in the film, you're right. Rachel shows up and we're like, well, that's not how people behave. But even
that's
then,
not a human being's hairdo.
But I will even say to that,
hair,
the one thing the film does well, because in the novel, the Voight-Kampff happens a number of times. The one thing I think it does well is we only see the Voight-Kampff performed once before by a person we know is a replicant, right? And that replicant freaks the fuck out, right? That replicant, while taking the test, is bugging the fuck out, right? And like, why are you asking me that? What does that mean? What is this? What is that? So we know from in the film, okay, a replicant will freak out when given the Voight-Kampff because we saw this guy do that. So then we sit down Rachel, who we're told isn't a replicant, and she does not react the way the replicant reacted to the Voight-Kampff. It's hard, like I said,
Right.
it's hard for us to watch this movie for the first time again. But I'm just saying, if you're just going off that, the movie has shown us if a replicant is subjected to the Voight-Kampff test, he bugs the fuck out. So if Rachel isn't freaking out, then perhaps she's a human, because that's how humans react.
I will. Is that necessarily true? Because Deckard says it takes usually 20 to 30 questions to get an answer, and it seems more like the guy in the beginning's freaking out because he's going into the company undercover, and he's like basically worried that he's about to get caught. Like, he knows he's doing something wrong.
I want to be clear. I'm not talking about, does this hold up to the scrutiny of 40 years? But I'm just saying in terms of, if you are an audience member seeing this movie for the first time, and I say this with I watched it with somebody who had never seen the movie before, who did not know she was a robot or a replicant until Deckard says the line. So I do think it is possible on your first viewing. Be careful. I do think it is possible on your first viewing.
I'm just going to say, your lovely girlfriend.
I have a very short turnaround to edit this, so please be careful with whatever is about to come out of your mouth.
I'm not going to say anything vulgar. I'm just going to say, this is a girl who was watching wrestling for a while and still had to go, which one is Luchasaurus? And you go, you don't realize the dinosaur-themed wrestler is the guy in the dinosaur mask?
I'm just saying. I'm trying here to step in and say, like, look, it is, as I said, hard for us to divorce ourselves from what we know about this film. And I do think within the world of the film, on a first viewing, it is entirely possible to not suspect Rachel's a replicant because she responds differently. That's all I'm saying.
I hear you. I mean, I think that what I found interesting on this watch for me is this sort of uneasy relationship between Deckard and Rachel.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still not entirely sure that I buy like the romance per se.
No,
he really does like foist himself on her and kind of demand for her to fall in love with him, and then she.
That's kind of just like noir. And also movies of that era where you just kind of have to go, hey, it's a movie. It's a guy and a gal. They fall in love because that's what the script says. And it's like, okay.
No, for sure. It's just interesting watching it this time. The Sean Young stuff. That's a different movie.
Very different movie.
Sean Young is very good in this movie. At the same time, she's a little bit of sort of. I don't think that Rachel's written particularly well. I think that Sean's bringing something to it, and there's obviously the aesthetic, and she's got just a great vibe, and that's working. I want to just point out one other thing, which is just a weird corollary that I had never noticed before this rewatch. When Daryl Hannah sprays that black paint on her eyes, it made me immediately think of Rooney Mara as Lisbeth Salander when she spray paints black on her eyes before she gets her revenge on her rapist. I wonder, because obviously Blade Runner is one of Fincher's favorite films, which should surprise nobody. I just wonder whether or not there's some sort of a connection.
I'm sure there is, but that being said, I do think that there is something. You mentioned Daryl Hannah. We haven't brought Daryl Hannah up at all.
She's so good in this.
But this is the thing. The reason we haven't brought Daryl Hannah up at all is, and maybe you guys will have a different experience than me.
Yeah.
Every time I actually sit down to watch Blade Runner, I forget how comparatively inconsequential Pris is in the film itself compared to how much that character stays with you after it's a to bring up Star Wars again, Pris is kind of a Boba Fett thing of like you kind of just go, because it's such a great look and such a great vibe that you go, there's no fucking way she's only in this thing for like X amount of time. You're like, no, Pris is like a crucial part of this movie. And then you sit down and watch it and you're like, right, she just makes a lot of the time she has on screen. She's not vital to the plot. She's not
a little vital
to not
her
as much.
Friendship to JF is what gets them to Tyrell, right?
Yes, but I'm saying like it's not a case of like when you think about this movie, and especially like anytime you open like a film book, right? Especially when you're like in the 90s, 2000s, we've talked about this in the pod, like when you were a kid or in the 90s, 2000s, and you go to a library in school and they'd have movie books. There's almost always a picture of Pris. So much so that you would think she's Rachel, with how much she is part of the visual language of this film. And yet, like you mentioned, Phil, the paint across the eyes. That's an iconic look from this movie that is a thing that just happens because it happens in this movie.
Yep.
Her even having like the wild fucking hair is like for 5 minutes while she's fighting Deckard. But you would think that is so much so that I think for a long chunk of time, because, it was harder to watch movies, back when we were younger. For a long chunk of time, I forgot about Zora entirely as like a young person and just kind of remembered that Daryl Hannah is in the movie for that amount of time. You know what I'm saying? Because she's
Zora has very little screen time when everything is said and done.
You kind of just
you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So
I think that also like Roy's affections for Pris are interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, she's ultimately last one standing. It's the two of them. Like that's it.
Yeah.
Everything. But, yeah. I mean, I kind of love Pris's fighting style, if that's the right way to describe it. It's a
thunder
lot of
thighs.
It's a lot of thunder thighs and backflips and.
I love how much Deckard just gets his ass kicked in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Just an absolute ineffectual
thing, right?
But even more so, this guy is just an absolute doofus who should not be allowed to hunt anything because he gets a lucky shot or two off on Zora. Rachel kills the big guy because he's about... and then Roy Batty just lets him live because he's like, well, I'm dying, so, Yeah,
I mean,
good job, buddy.
Fight. This time round, that fight really kind of... the first half of the fight is so messy and kind of like chaotic, and like Roy's just smashing his face through walls and just like mocking him and doing like weird kabuki theater stuff that I don't totally get. And it's just Deckard running from him, really. Like it's really just like him trying to get away from him. And then he fucks up his fingers.
Yeah.
And so he can't really do anything, which I think is supposed to be a parallel to Roy's hand not working.
Mm-hmm.
Am I crazy that's sort of... Anyway. And then like there's this whole sort of cat and mouse thing where it's Deckard just like hiding from him. It's really... you're not wrong that like Deckard really is in over his head with most of these. But I would also say we're led to believe that they are super fucking strong. So like he knows if he gets also, with the grip of these things.
Well, but it's also...
it's just funny because they set up like, oh, Deckard, you're the best Blade Runner we got. If he's the best, good grief, how did any of you fuckers succeed?
But that is what I know you guys said, whatever, on the is he a replicant or not. Even before we had the final cut and all stuff, I remember that being one of the things that was part of the is he a replicant or not conversation, because you can easily read this movie not as... you can easily read this movie not as a case of like Deckard's the best Blade Runner, but rather like, shit, we got to get rid of these Nexus 6, right?
Yeah.
Activate this machine we built. We've programmed him to think he's a Blade Runner. That way, like, if they kill him, no damage, right? We didn't hurt a person in doing this. And theoretically, there's 50 Deckards in a freezer just ready to go. That also can explain why Gaff has the reaction to him that he has, right? Because if you watch the movie from the perspective of you just activated this replicant, the way Gaff talks to him and reacts to him compared to how Deckard is, whereas Deckard's like, it's my old pal Gaff, and Gaff kind of has to keep going, yeah, sure. I've known you a long time, Deckard. Fucking for sure, I guess. And I'm
definitely there. I also... Can I give a shout out to Emmett Walsh for a second here?
Always. You can do that all the time, even for movies he's not in. You are always welcome to shout out Emmett Walsh here.
He was always so fucking good.
Mm-hmm.
I just feel like every time he pops up in a movie, you're just like, this scene's gonna be great. Like him just saying stuff like, I've got 4 skin jobs walking the streets, or he can breathe okay as long as no one unplugs him.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Well, that's
Emmett has like 2 scenes and he just crushes them. Or 3
that's
scenes and crushes them.
even that, like those kind of terms. That's something that, to go back to the thing I was talking about earlier.
Yes. Yep.
The world needs to feel lived in, right?
Totally.
And using terms like skin job and things like that, you know, it's something.
Yep.
I'm not trying to start a whole argument about it.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
But no, I'm because I think Tom knows where I'm going to go with this. But like, I am one of those rare people who, like, I think the first John Wick is one of the greatest films of the last 10 years. And I have no patience for the sequels, because the fun I had when I saw the first John Wick was that's a movie, even though it's not sci-fi, that's a movie that's like, we built a whole world that we're going to show you and we will answer 0 questions. There's a hotel full of hitmen. We're not going to tell you why. We're not going to explain a fucking thing. Things just happen. And I totally get people who are like, I want to hear more of that, right? But for me, it's no different than if Blade Runner Black Lotus, which is the anime show for Crunchyroll and Adult Swim that I watched all of and don't remember, if they were like, we're going to do a whole episode explaining why we call them skin jobs. It's like, I don't need you to do that. I do not need you to do that.
Here's what I'll say. I agree with you most of the time, Tom, that because we live in a world of IP and franchises and what have you, the studios constantly point and be like, unpack that for us and do that. Like there's runway here if we do this, and this. And I agree with you that more times than not, that is completely useless, or is just sort of like fan servicey in a weird way. I can't speak to any of the Blade Runner ephemera that exists because I have not seen any of it outside of Blade Runner 2049, which, as I said, I quite liked because I think it finds the balance that a lot of legacy sequels don't do. But all that's to say that, to your initial point, throwing in jargon and throwing in stuff that exists within the universe that you don't explain, I agree with you, makes you feel like you're in on something. And it's just kind of just, letting you know that this is how people speak. And I think that's all.
Because it's like, let's even set aside 2049. That's contentious. But like, going through some of the graphic novels, going through Black Lotus, anything like that, the thing that's so frustrating, and it's the same as like the conversation around like, would they ever make a non-Wachowski Matrix movie, right? You don't want that.
It's Wachowski, right?
I think yes.
It is
Wachowski. Yes, Wachowski. Yes. Okay. It's when you I took a swing. But it's like, the reason you don't want that is the same reason like very few people really go to bat for the PlayStation 2 video game or anything, and it's because the world gives the creator, whether it's the Wachowskis or, with Blade Runner and Ridley, runway to do something interesting within the world. But if you open it up to a bunch of other people, a lot of times it just winds up being, hey, do you want to see that same sci-fi story you've seen 7 times, but in the world of Blade Runner?
I mean,
again,
it's
like nobody.
I don't even think it's about an ephemera thing or a sequelizing thing. It's a thing of just, if you don't get the right people to do it, it's not going to be good. Like is the anime bad? I don't know. Literally didn't know it existed until Mike decided to bring it up today. It's probably bad because they probably just got some guys to do it and really just said, whatever, just do it.
Oh.
The Matrix video games, I played them. They're not good. The ideas behind them were good, but it's clear that the issue behind them was execution. That's ultimately the main problem of these things. Why does like Blade Runner 2049 have a better legacy as a legacy sequel than, say, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull or an even Dial of Destiny? Harrison Ford's done a lot of these fucking things, apparently. Because you just did it better. Like, that's just kind of like the end point of all this. Why is Matrix Resurrections kind of contentious? Because nobody can agree if it was done well.
Wow. It was.
I liked it.
Spoiler.
It's the third best of the franchise, though.
The third best in the franchise. Yeah. I'll give you that, yeah.
Yeah, it's better than Reloaded.
Oh, no.
Revolutions rules. Revolutions is the best. It rules. It's awesome.
You loving Revolutions is the most Tom take ever. Because, of course you do.
Listen, I have to live my truth. And
as you should, for sure. It's got a lot of people with Gatling guns. That's
well, listen, they fight an army of like spider robot things.
they do. They do. Yeah.
And honestly, just quick sidebar, but Matrix Revolution, the ending of Matrix Revolutions of Neo fighting Smith for the final time is, I think, the best cinematic like superhero
fighting. I agree.
Until, again, a contentious movie, but until the third act stuff in Man of Steel. Zack Snyder got... listen, we're not talking about... I'm talking about actually portraying powers on screen. You felt like you were watching superheroes, just like in Matrix Revolutions. You kind of felt like, oh, this just feels like an anime fight. Somehow they made it work. I don't know.
This actually segues back to Blade Runner in an interesting way.
So I was going to say, we're not talking Matrix for another 30 years on this show. So we'll get there, but we got a couple seasons.
I hope I don't get there.
I think that the fights in this, we talked about it earlier a little bit, but like one of the reasons that I think Harrison Ford is one of our best action heroes is because he fights like a real person.
Well, he's also not afraid to look like a doofus.
He's not afraid to look dumb, but he's also not afraid to sort of not even look weak, but just look human. And I think that
he'll take a punch, he'll get his fingers cracked,
he'll fall awkwardly, he'll do the sort of shit that makes him even back in the day, like when he was at his most like physical peak, he still like looked like an attainable physical peak, right? Like he doesn't look like fucking one of the Chris's do today. You know what I mean? He looked like a normal human being that works out a bunch. And I guess what I'm saying is I think that Harrison's dislike of this movie feels to me akin to, first of all, where he was in his career. Like he was kind of like, I mean, listen, the guy was a curmudgeon for a while, but he was very sort of like stuck in that Star Wars, Indiana Jones-y kind of world. And you could tell that he was just sort of like, what's kind of funny about this, honestly, is that Ridley was giving him an opportunity to play a different tempo and a different type of character, and he didn't seem to want to, but he also did want to.
I don't know if it's that he didn't want to. I think it's twofold. I think it's that he really didn't like working with Ridley.
Sure.
And I think it's the fact that the movie failed. I mean, I know I've heard a lot of scuttlebutt that the failures of movies like this or The Mosquito Coast or things where like he's truly trying to break out of being an action star and like I want to start showing my range and doing these other things. The failure of those movies is pretty much what essentially signified his downfall in the 90s. Like, he makes The Fugitive and Air Force One, but like he never really does anything that's not action movie guy until fucking Morning Glory.
I think there's another element too, though.
Sabrina, but yeah.
I think there's another element. There's another element too, though, beyond like thinking about the career, and it's something that we've all worked on film and television to one degree or another. We've all experienced, and I feel you've probably dealt with this the most of all, which is setting aside any career thing or anything like that. Being an actor, there is a level of vulnerability because you are working with other people, a writer, a director, who you are putting a level of trust in, right?
Sure.
And they are asking that, Phil, when you write a piece of dialogue, right? If an actor comes up to you and they go, hey, I don't know if this is going to work, or I'm worried how this is going to look. Is this going to, not that you've necessarily on set had people walk up to you and say explicitly, hey, will I look silly if I say this, right?
Yeah, they generally don't say it like that.
No, I know, but there's something to that, right? But these actors are like, hey man, I may not get what's on the page, but I am trusting that even if I do something on set that looks silly, you are going, by the time this thing is edited and on screen, it's going to work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some of the best relationships are built that way when it works, right? Star Wars is a perfect example of Harrison, telling George Lucas, like, George, you can type this shit, but you don't have to read it. A lot of people involved in Star Wars were like, this is not going to work. I'm trusting you, but I don't know if it's going to work. And it worked, right?
Sure.
I think for actors and other creatives, like, there is this element too on a raw emotional level of like, if it was a fraught time on set and you have this guy who is the boss in charge of everything. You have this director, you have this auteur who is like, trust me, it may not feel right now, but it's gonna work. I promise it's gonna work. And then when it doesn't work, or I'm sure, if Harrison sat down and Blade Runner screens and it doesn't work for him, maybe there's still an element of hearing like, hey, it may not be my thing, but if it hits, it hits. And then when it doesn't, there's also just on a purely emotional level, a sense of betrayal of like, hey man, I trusted you and you made me look stupid. Not even just like, oh, my career's dipped, but just like,
sure,
you told me to trust. Think about like, the reason I remember it is I was at Comic-Con one year, and the late Kevin Conroy, the voice actor for Batman on the animated series, right? There was a Q&A with him, and somebody got up and said, hey, Kevin, and he was trying to be a bit of a prick, and he's like, hey, Kevin, can you tell us like what you think of that stupid Batman voice Christian Bale does, right? And I remember Kevin Conroy like got very serious, and he goes, I want to address that. He goes, because I think that's really unfair. I don't like anybody coming at Christian for that voice. He goes, when you're an actor, your director's job is to tell you when you've gone too far. If your director asks you for more, you got to give him more. So if the director of that film is telling Christian, deeper, growlier, you as an actor are trusting that the director knows what they're doing and the director isn't going to make you look silly. He goes, and
right.
So I've always thought of that in terms of like, when it comes to Harrison, yes, he's a curmudgeon, but I do think some of the element of that with Blade Runner is like, I fought with you. I had to put up with all of your shit. You gave me a lot of trust me. And this thing didn't work. Well, I wonder if there's like something.
And you hear about the way Ridley works, and this is like one of the few times you'll ever hear Tom Cruise speak ill about working with somebody. He talked about working on Legend, and he said it was the worst because Ridley treats the actors like toys. You don't bring anything to it. You just do what he says. You hit your marks. You say the lines exactly the way he does it. There's no experimenting, and then you move on to the next setup. Not to say that Tom Cruise or even Harrison Ford are like Robert Downey Jr. level of improvisatory actors, but like there's a sense with both of those guys of like, we kind of try to find things, and like if something comes up on the day, like let's involve it, let's sort of experiment. I love you. I know, one of the most iconic lines in Star Wars, came up with it because they couldn't crack it in the script. The fight in Raiders of the Lost Ark where he just shoots the guy. Harrison was sick, and he's like, I can't do the fight. Just shoot him. So there's got to be a sense of Harrison coming onto a set with a filmmaker that has a style that just doesn't mesh with him, but being like, all right, well, this guy made Alien. He seems to know what he's doing. This is not Han Solo. This is not Indiana Jones. I'm branching out, and this just, as much like Mike said, as much as I fought with him, as much as I tried, I relented, and I just did what this guy wanted, and I even came back for the studio to do this fucking nonsense voiceover. And it just, quote unquote, didn't work.
And it's like, Phil, you've just to make this point a little clear, Phil, you've been in this industry a long time, right? You've done this.
Not that long, but okay.
What I mean is like long enough that if I asked you to speak generally about, what I mean is if I asked you to speak generally about working in the film and television industry, it wouldn't be selling out any one particular project or anything, right?
Correct.
That's what I mean. I'm prefacing it that way.
Yeah.
And Tom and I both work in media and in journalism, so we've had similar experiences too. But there's also just this element of, there's moments, it has to have happened. It's happened to you where like you had something on the page or you had a creative direction. Somebody above you was like, no, we're changing that. We're doing it this way. And then when they do it their way and it screens, whether it test screens or it actually makes it to air, and it's not successful, there is a part of you that, you're bummed, but there's also a part of you that like for a moment goes, I fucking told you. Yeah, I fucking told you that was going to bomb if you did that. I told you this was not going to do numbers if you pulled that shit. Like, it's... So I wonder if Harrison being bitchy to Blade Runner is also like a bit of vindication in that way. But I don't know if you disagree, but you know what I'm saying?
I know. I do hear what both of you are saying. I think that... Listen, none of us were on set. None of us know what actually transpired between these two people. And, you know, yes, Ridley is a notoriously persnickety guy. You know, he's much more interested in sort of the scope and the look of a movie, maybe more so than the performances sometimes. But I also think that, you know, Harrison's is sort of in a weird time in his career. I mean, the truth is that up until recently, and I mean recently, I want to say within the last like few years, something happened to Harrison Ford, and he seems like he's having the time of his life right now. He seems like he's just happy as a pig in shit. He's laughing at award shows. He's doing TV shows. He seems to be genuinely having fun. And I'm thrilled for him because it seems like for the previous 60 some odd years, he did not seem like he was having a good time doing what he was doing. So that's just a hard presence to have on set, period, right? Like, it just is when you're number one on your call sheet is a person who just doesn't seem particularly happy. That's just tough. And it's hard for leadership. It's hard for stewardship. It's just tough. And I don't say this with judgment. I'm sure Harrison Ford had any number of reasons to be unhappy, but like, it's just hard. So, you know, it makes for a tough set when you've got two alphas, right?
And,
Like,
you know, it's just one of those things of like, we're following up Alien.
Well,
I'm gonna you're kind of in like a bad spot, and you know, like I said, the culture kind of seemed like it moved away from what this movie's laying down, you know. So like,
well,
I don't know, like there's a lot of. It seems like there's probably a lot of cocky energy. A lot of like, hey, I did Alien and I'm following it up and I'm gonna do better than Alien. Like this is gonna be like I'm gonna lay my dick on the table, and then everyone's just like, no, call HR.
I mean, I think Legend is when he really thought he was fucking going.
Oh, Legend sucks.
I want to touch on
Legend sucks.
I want to touch on two things, obviously, before we fully wind down. One is, of course. You know, we didn't really talk about the differences too much, so we should at least pay a little lip service to the fact that the biggest difference between the theatrical cut and the director's cut is obviously the theatrical cut has this horribly forced voiceover where, so now Phil, you said you watched the final cut, not the theatrical cut, right?
Yeah. So what ultimately happened was, because we emailed about this a little bit, and I was like, which one are we going to watch? And I think we landed on the theatrical, but then I went online and saw that the final cut was in 4K and had all the various bells and whistles, and I bought that instead. So that's ultimately what it comes down to.
Which version did you watch, Tom?
Final cut.
Okay. Now, please notice, Phil, Tom doesn't even try and make an excuse. He's just like, I didn't want to.
I have the 4K of the final cut.
Now, here's the thing. Yes, but here is the thing about me being the only one that watched the version of the film that we said we were going to watch.
But I did, to be clear, I did go online to watch some of the stuff from the theatrical.
But,
so I had.
See, Phil, you're saying some of the stuff. I want to say, audience, if you can tell on our faces, which one watched the theatrical cut in full, because only one of us here has recently heard Harrison Ford drop the N-word in full. Yeah, that's in the voiceover. In the voiceover, because you're like already watching the movie and going, because again, I watched it with my partner. You're already watching the movie, and right when he starts talking, and my partner knew nothing about the multiple cuts. She knew nothing about any of this. Right when Harrison starts talking in voiceover, she goes, he sounds like he doesn't want to be here. I'm like, it's funny you say that. But then he's talking, and we introduce the M. Emmett Walsh character. And Harrison's like, yeah, he's a real hard ass. He's a guy who back in the old days used to call black people, and then just drops the N-word. And it is deeply jarring.
That's awful.
It's shocking. And you're like, who okayed this? Who at the studio was like, we need to make this movie more accessible? Deckard's gonna say a slur. Yeah, who was doing that?
Well, it is the Reagan 80s.
Yeah. The other difference, obviously, we've touched on, there was a conversation about is Deckard a replicant or not. If you watched the theatrical cut, if anybody did, the weird thing is they don't include this is Deckard a replicant stuff anywhere else in the film, but it still ends with Gaff leaving this little origami unicorn, which means nothing in the theatrical cut. Doesn't mean a fucking thing, but you still see it. And obviously in the other cuts, it's Deckard has these dreams about unicorns, and it's a way to suggest, hey man, I know what you've been dreaming about. Your memories and dreams are implanted and all of that. I do just want to touch on like some of the differences between the cuts, because I feel like we've been alluding to there's differences without saying. But the other thing I wanted to do is, as a wind down before we talk Oscars or anything, is as sort of a tease for the next season. We keep hinting at this is 1982. E.T. eats Blade Runner's lunch as a sci-fi film. Yeah. I don't know if you could have... People often, when they make this comparison, they talk about like The Thing against E.T., because obviously they're both alien movies, right? But even Blade Runner against E.T. Don't worry about it. It's just going to keep going. We're good.
Okay. I was like, you just disappeared.
Yeah, it flickers for a second. It's a weird thing. We're trying to figure out alternatives for it. But yes. I wanted to just open for to kind of talk about... Take a second to just kind of compare and contrast the vibes of E.T. and Blade Runner in that respective time.
What's fascinating about comparing the two is that you have this movie, Blade Runner, which is one of the most incredible technological feats in cinematic history. And then you have E.T., where the puppet fucking sucks. And
what? I don't disagree.
But I'm about to compliment. This is a compliment to the filmmaking, though. That Steven Spielberg is such a good filmmaker that he took a puppet that barely can move and is kind of just a lump of crap and kind of just waddles. And with his filmmaking and with the score, you don't mind that the puppet sucks.
I can't wait for our ET episode.
But I'm complimenting the movie. It's about how cinema can overcome the sum of its parts to be greater.
I'm gonna leave your puppet slander aside for a second and just say that the reason that a movie like ET hits and a movie like Blade Runner and The Thing doesn't to the same degree is it is the most joyous, open-hearted piece of cinema. You are flying with that movie, right?
Well,
you've got John Williams.
Because that movie's less interested in the sci-fi stuff than it is about the emotional stuff. That's kind of the juice of the movie, is that it's a family movie and it's about the emotions.
I think
this is like an old movie.
I think that E.T. notwithstanding, I think you could take E.T. out of this equation entirely, and I still think that Blade Runner and The Thing don't hit. I don't think they hit.
No,
they might not have gotten crushed as hard as they did in the box office.
No, it's just.
But like both of those films are
80s were
deeply nihilistic.
Yeah,
they're. I love both those movies, to be very clear. I love all three of these movies, but like I think there is something to be said for, audiences universally wanting to embrace something that is far more entertaining and loving, and on its face it's about kids, and just like it's a completely different animal.
It's a movie that, I mean, maybe the first movie, at least successful movie, that kind of makes the argument that's telling its audience of kids that are kind of going through the first wave of like divorces, saying like, hey guys, it's gonna be okay.
That's true. That's
like
true.
The latchkey era and the divorced kids era was kind of like the 80s. Like I know it existed beforehand, but like as a massive thing that kids went through, like in a big, large scale, was the 80s. Yeah. So for a movie like that to come out and be like, guys, I went through this, and I'm gonna tell it in a story about a little alien guy coming around.
Yeah, I mean,
it's gonna be okay. It's not gonna be perfect, but you're gonna be okay.
I mean, I wonder.
Which is not what the thing is. The thing's like, the world's gonna end.
Well,
the world's gonna end. Everything sucks.
I wonder if, in some sense, when you look at that and you look at the success of E.T. compared to like Blade Runner, or anything, I wonder if it really just boils down to, beyond the filmmaking, beyond any of that, if people always talk about around that time period in like 1980, the very famous "It's Morning in America" political ad, right?
Of course, yeah.
And if there was this feeling, and I'm not trying to tie it too much into the current day, right? But like, there is a theory of thought about politics when you look at the current day and why things went the way they did, is people just reached a point of being tired of being upset about things. And when you look at, talk about, Tom made the point about like, well, speaking to kids of divorce and saying things are going to be all right. I wonder if there's also just an element of dystopic sci-fi going out of fashion because people in general were like, I don't know, man, I've done enough grappling with God and mortality. Like, just tell me things are going to be all right. Not to paraphrase Kendrick Lamar in the whitest way possible. But, like there is that feeling of like, you want to feel like, to one degree, of like, we're going to be all right. We're going to be all right. Things are going to be fine. And I do think like, there's a lot of early 80s stuff that, I've sometimes joked about like my aversion to 80s is so much of that content feels like the Everything is Awesome song from the Lego movie, where it's just like sweeping a lot of shit under the rug. But the more I get older, the more I look at that and realize like, right, there's this cyclical thing in humanity. It's kind of like I just filed a piece for my day job about the Manson murders, right? And I kind of touch on Quentin Tarantino's point in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood of like, even if the Manson murders hadn't have happened, we were at a point in the late 60s where American society was like, we're done with this. We are looking for any excuse to be done with the hippies and the counterculture and just put that away for a bit. And I do think like Morning in America succeeds. E.T. kind of latches on where it does because the public and the audience can only take so much cynicism. And I wonder if beyond the cut not working or anything like that, something like Blade Runner in particular was trying to tap into a like, let's think about how we treat each other and let's think about like what defines a human and like, let's think about confronting God and yelling at our own God for making us mortal. And maybe audiences were, to one degree or another in 1982, as opposed to 79 when Alien comes out and people are like, hey man, sure. With 1982, maybe there is just an audience that's kind of going, I truly cannot think about that. I just can't think about it.
These movies, Blade Runner and The Thing, are movies that should have come out in the 70s, but they had the bad fortune of coming out in the 80s.
Or the 90s.
And not even the 90s, because the 90s still, like, had a different vibe. Well,
but you get Dark City 70s. In the 90s, you get The Matrix, you get the X-Files.
But Dark City,
things that are a little more...
You do, but Dark City isn't a success. The X-Files is still, like, not horrifically cynical the way, like, The Thing and Blade Runner are, or nihilistic, I should say. And The Matrix is a kung fu movie to sort of dilute some of the heavier elements, which is why a lot of morons can watch that movie and be like, this is cool! And then they watch the sequels, and it's just like...
I also just say that, these... Alien is a simple movie. Mm-hmm. It's about a fucking alien that's killing everybody, and it needs to be killed.
Hot take.
Blade Runner and even The Thing, quite frankly, because of its shape-shifting kind of, existential, who can I trust? Both these movies are just challenging movies on a purely story-based level, right? Like, take everything that you guys are talking about, not to be, but like, if you put all of that aside and you just look at the storytelling of both of these movies, they are challenging in a storytelling fashion that I imagine audiences still wouldn't be particularly interested in.
But
as opposed to Alien, which is quite simply just, it's a monster movie.
But I would say The Thing and Alien are very similar. Isolated, trapped with a monster that we can't find, and it's maybe inside of you until it's too late and it pops out of your goddamn chest. They're similar. I'm not saying they're the same, but they're very similar. They're very straightforward stories.
I think that
there's Lovecraftian type vibes to both.
I just think that, but I think that Ridley Scott gave us the most high art version of a monster movie. John Carpenter gave us the most sort of like existential, grim. You're in the fucking tundra. You don't know what the monster is. There is like, you never see the thing really when everything is said and done. I mean, you do, but you kind of don't, in terms of like what its actual final form is, if that makes any sense.
But isn't that essentially kind of what we're saying, is that it's more
Alien
challenging.
is just a lot easier to understand.
No, I see what Phil's saying, and I agree.
I see what you're saying, but I think that's like,
no one's
that's kind
coming
of
at
getting
the
into
thing
the
here. Like, nobody's attacking.
No, it's not about it's not about attacking the thing. It's basically, we're kind of saying the same thing. It's that culturally, people didn't want a complicated, harsh movie. Alien. I mean, you look at the Alien movie that was successful in the 80s, Aliens. It's just a movie where they go, well, what if there's more of them and we can shoot them a lot?
Sure, but I think at the end of the day, and we will wind down, but at the end of the day, I think the difference is something like The Thing or Blade Runner. These are the kind of movies that make us ask the question of like, are we the monster all along, right? Whereas Alien at its core is a movie that goes, the monster is that thing over there. It wants to kill you and it needs to die. There is no part of this in Alien that makes you try to feel empathy for the xenomorph, which is where, not to suddenly heel turn on Phil here, which is where the Ridley prequels to Alien run into some trouble for certain audience members, because it's like, hey, I really want to get existential and philosophical about the alien and how it was created. And some part of the audience goes, bro, I just want to see it get shot with guns. I want the
watch
alien to
Alien
come down
Covenant, and you'll see it a lot. Anyway.
And Alien Romulus.
Anyway.
There is one element that we really need to talk about before we do the Oscars, even if it's brief.
Oh, I know what you're going to say, because you're right. We missed this completely.
It's Rutger Hauer.
Oh, never mind. I was going to say the exact opposite. Well, not the opposite. There's two elements.
There's rules.
I mean, he not to say he makes the movie, but that he makes the story work.
Mm-hmm.
Because, he brings such a complicated humanity to the robot that if you don't feel what he's feeling and feel the empathy for this guy, and you don't believe the turn at the end of him saving Deckard and then giving that speech, which he came up with on the day.
He altered, right? There was more on the page. There was a lot on the page, and he was like, I'm going to say these two things, and then I'm going to add the line tears and rain. Like, I'm going to tweak this so it works.
He is almost the reason why 40 years later this movie still can work for a modern audience, which is that of all of the complicated nonsense with the different cuts and the different changes in each cut, Roy Batty's he's the guy in every cut of the movie. He's his performance, his character, his arc is the same, and his work is so transcendent that no matter what cut you watch, you can go, oh, this guy is the best. And I'm kind of sad that Roy Batty has to die. And I'm also kind of sad that America never really knew what to do with Rutger Hauer outside of like The Hitcher. Like,
I agree, but I do think it's funny, Tom, you talking about that ending and that ending speech and the element that really makes it work. Not to take away from Rutger Hauer, but there's one other element at play during that ending speech that makes it work. And that's the thing I was thinking, which is
the bird,
the Vangelis score.
Oh, sure.
The score from Vangelis. So much so that, like, as much as I was not looking forward to 2049, I remember when that trailer came out and you first hear that bow, 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 and I was just like, all right, I'm going to get you. It's not to start an old argument, but like there's something you talked about way back on Phil, when we were talking about like, you talked about going to the theater to see Top Gun 2, right? And when the Top Gun,
great.
But hang on, my point is just you talked about when the Top Gun score started, you felt like, all right, I'm a little already I'm a little interested to get back into this. That for me, I don't have that for Top Gun, but that for me is that Vangelis score. In that
I get that.
2049
That makes sense,
trailer, when it starts playing, there's just a part of me that goes like, okay, I can dive back in a little bit. And to tie into what Tom is saying, that moment when Rutger Hauer is giving that speech, so much of the movie in the theatrical cut is Harrison Ford's bad voiceover clashing with this beautiful Vangelis score. And that moment where Rutger Hauer is giving that speech while this synth poetry is playing under him.
It's the best. It's so
He's
good.
never gotten a moment that good again. I mean, I haven't watched Hobo and a Shotgun for a while, but I assume he never got a moment quite like that again.
Well, you are forgetting about the bit in Batman Begins where he goes, "What? Didn't you get the memo?"
Oh, Rutger.
I always
R.I.P.
I always just think of Sam Jackson and Jackie Brown just going, "Oh shit, Rutger Hauer." I don't know why, but anytime I hear his name,
And it's not him.
Yeah.
I don't think.
Yeah, he's watching the fucking the.
He's watching like a gun show. Or
He's
something
watching
like
the fucking like commercial for guns, and he's just like, "Oh shit, is that Rutger Hauer?"
And Bridget says, "It's Demi Moore."
By the way, I just want to close this out. Well, before we close out, I just want to close out by noting Tom just said he's watching the commercial for guns, and to give you a sense of what Philip K. Dick's Android's Dream of Electric Sheep is like, there would be a sentence going, he was watching the commercial for guns.
Well, listen,
Because in the future...
At the end of the day, the fact that we got anything watchable from the narrative works of a drug-addicted schizophrenic is a miracle.
Yeah.
All
right.
Ridley Scott, Richard Linklater, and arguably Denis Villeneuve, probably the only guys that were able to do it. The show for Amazon, by the way, there's no way that show's going to be good. No way. It's going to be...
What show for Amazon? Is this... Oh, this is the Blade Runner...
They're doing like Blade Runner like 2077 or some shit. It's not going to be good. I'm just putting it out there. Not going to be good.
So winding down, as we always do, and Phil, if you don't know this by heart, you're welcome to guess as well. But how do we think Blade Runner fared at the Academy Awards that year?
Not
well. Probably, I think a few noms: cinematography, production design, score. That's probably about it.
I would go even lower. I think maybe... Did we have visual effects nominations?
Visual effects existed at that time, yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna. I think I got a visual effects nomination. Sound.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I think.
Now, do you think? Here's what I'll say. Do you think it should have won in any categories?
Yeah, I think it should have won in production design, costumes, cinematography, score.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
well,
I'm glad you said that one, Phil, because I've been waiting on this. Because remember, this is the ET year. So I want you to actually.
I think it should have been nominated.
Vangelis versus Williams. How do you feel?
It's not even close.
Okay.
John Williams fucking trounces.
Now I will say
Vangelis' score is some next level
trounces.
Shit. It should be noted.
I love that visual. John Williams just coming out of the shadows with his
just fucking wailing on them. Yeah.
So, because I just want to note, because it is not, I don't want to be too hard on Vangelis here.
Okay.
We should note, Vangelis did win Best Original Score the year before for Chariots of Fire. I just wanted to double check my math here. So
that sounds right.
Don't feel bad about how things went for the Blade Runner score. So, Blade Runner was not nominated for Best Picture. The nominees that year were E.T. the Extraterrestrial, Missing, Tootsie, The Verdict, and the winner, Gandhi. It was nominated in two categories. It was nominated for Best Art Direction, which it lost to Gandhi. And it was And it was nominated for Best Visual Effects, which it lost to E.T. the Extraterrestrial.
Yeah.
So
I mean, listen, I'll say this. Blade Runner's got better special effects than E.T. I'm not delusional. I obviously can see that with my eyes. That's crazy that it lost that award. I think it's insane that Gandhi won art direction.
Well, see, Gandhi also
won cinematography over E.T.
See, Gandhi had such a hard job for art direction, though. You know, what if there were Indians in a place where there were only Indians?
I mean, no. This is Phil. In fairness, this is a thing we have talked about on our Oscar special that aired like 2 weeks before this, which is particularly for Tom and I. Like, in fairness, when it comes to art direction, we are always
or costume design
or costume design. I think we're always more in favor of fantasy that has to create something out of nothing, as opposed to we're period pieces where it's. I made the joke on our Oscar special, but you know, if making somebody dress like Bob Dylan in the 60s gets you an Oscar nomination, then I should have been nominated when I was 15 years old from my closet. You know, there's something about like there's something.
I don't know that that's a 1-to-1, Mike.
No, but it's being broad to serve a purpose, which is like it does always feel a little silly when the Oscars are like, and the nominees for best costume design. Well, this woman who designed costumes imagining 5 different fantasy tribes from 5 different planets that went from different biomes, or this person who replicated photographs from the 70s. Yeah. It's like,
and went to a thrift store.
You can't put them against each other. That's just unfair.
Yeah.
So
I think it's also, I mean, I do think that period stuff is hard when it is like, you know, fucking Victorian shit.
Yeah.
Where like, you know, that's one thing. I agree with you that a complete unknown, it's right there for the taking.
I don't disagree. Yeah. Like that was, you know, I think it got costume design, not production design, but it's just kind of like, I can just go to the Cafe Wah right now. I can just get on a train and go there. I can't go to Arrakis. So there is a thing, you know, when you're comparing Gandhi to Blade Runner, there is an element of like, well,
yeah, it's crazy.
You could just go there. You could just go to a place.
There are flights.
Yeah. It's not. It's also like it's not. You know, you say replicating logo. It's Gandhi. It's not as though if there's anybody where the Indian government is going to be like, let's not tear down these buildings or these historic sites. It's Gandhi. You know what I mean? Like, we can still go see Abe Lincoln's Boyhood Home. It's there. We kept it for a reason. Anyway, that is how Blade Runner did at the Academy Awards that year. Of course, as we mentioned, it is up against E.T., which we will be talking about with Phil next season. It has been on the board since we started this show. And Phil,
can't wait.
What I will just tease, my friend, what an uphill battle you have. Now, we're not going to be mean about E.T. or anything.
Against who?
No, we're not going to be mean about E.T. or anything, but I will say, like, it is a case, Tom and I have talked about this many times, like, that is a movie that does not click for either of us. And so
we haven't had this conversation in a while because my views on E.T. have changed a lot since I was an angry teenager.
I want to be clear. No, I'm not saying as in I'm anti-E.T. at all, right? I'm not. I think it's more the case, like, Phil, you know how sometimes you've come on this show, because you do your AFI movie club, right? And you have talked about there are a number of films that you watch in that where you go, on a technical level, I recognize its importance. Like, on a technical level, I fully get why this is clicking for people. It is not my bag, right?
Oh, I will. There's one that I know that I saw you log on Letterboxd like last week. Yankee Doodle Dandy fucking sucks, bro.
Fuck that movie,
Tom.
Fuck that movie.
God, making my job harder. It's so again, like with ET, I'm excited to talk about it. No, I'm genuinely I'm excited to talk about it with you because it's I'm just owning the fact outright that like it is a thing that I'm not saying this to be a dick. I genuinely want to connect with that film because I have, on a personal level, like, I hear people talk about it. I just listened to Blank Check do 3 hours on E.T. and go like, well, it's Steven Spielberg's greatest film by far. Like, there's no doubt. There's no question. And I'm like,
it's not even a question.
have never...
No, it is a question. That's not true at all.
No, but I have never...
It's not even close.
I want
it's not even his best movie in the 80s.
Okay, Tom. Let's finish the episode. I'm saying I look forward to this because for me, no, I'm not being it. Like I look forward to this because
I'm looking at my
to,
Mondo poster for ET above my fucking computer.
It's just a case of like I have
probably
never
my favorite film,
and I'm saying like I genuinely want to do the thing we always talk about with this show, which is we always say if people are listening, they don't get why a movie works, we're going to help them get there. This is a case I'm just going to own up front. Like it has never been my bag, and I really look forward to trying to like have this conversation about it. And there's nobody that we would rather have for that conversation
that's very kind of
than our inaugural 5-timer, our always start the season,
film. I'm thrilled. I can't wait.
We love having you on. So please take the opportunity now. Tell folks what you're doing when you're not on this show.
I co-host podcasts like It's the 2000s with Emily St. James, who I believe has been on your podcast as well.
Correct.
Yes.
We
pre-child, so she's been too busy to return.
I mean,
or at least, or at least that's
for me to get her to schedule.
Or at least that's the excuse. Podcast. She's got a great out for not coming up. I'm
very
just
busy.
Just saying, if you don't want to deal with us, totally valid. Just say yeah. Just if you never want to come on the show again, just have a child, and we'll give you a pass. That's the rule.
We do mini-series within the decade of the 2000s. We're currently... When is this dropping?
This is coming out this Thursday.
Great.
Holy shit,
we are currently doing a mini-series on Tom Cruise's 2000s. Which was, as we all know, an interesting and emotional roller coaster for Tom Cruise. We have had Roxana Haddadi came on for Collateral, Bilga Abiri came on for The Last Samurai, Jamel Bowie came on for War of the Worlds, Liz Hanna just came on for Mission Impossible 3. So it's been a blast.
Who do you have for the Lions for Lambs episode?
Jason Bailey came on for Lions.
Oh my God, you actually did it. Okay. Wow. You guys really covered your bases. Good job.
He came on for that. We had Kenny Neibart and
how'd you land him?
We got him for Tropic Thunder, and then we wrapped up the series with David Iserson came on for Valkyrie. So that was it's a really fun miniseries. On the Patreon, I do the 90s. And I'm currently about to launch a miniseries on Best Actress 1995 Oscar nominations, all actors for all 5 episodes, which has been really fun to record. It's some heavy shit. Dead Man Walking, Leaving Las Vegas. Not exactly the most fun movies in the world, but people can subscribe there. www.patreon.com/podcast like it's.
I'm so sorry I laughed. I'm not laughing at the movies. I'm just laughing at. Did you ever see Hamlet 2, Phil?
Yeah, sure, of course, yeah.
I can't think of Leaving Las Vegas without just Steve Coogan going, Elizabeth Shue, leaving Las Vegas to a bunch of high school kids. It's a phenomenal moment.
Yeah, I mean, this is a hot take. Elizabeth Shue better in that movie than Nicolas Cage. That movie doesn't age well. It's one of those just like very Oscar baity movies where you're just like, okay, but yeah, I had some amazing guests, and yeah, I mean, we have a great miniseries coming up. I'm assuming. Well, Beyonce is our next miniseries.
A performer who the internet is very chill about.
Very chill about. She did 6 movies that she acted in, and then she never acted again.
Thank God.
And that's the way to do it, guys. Just 6 movies. I feel like Mike probably likes the Steve Martin Pink Panther movies. It feels like something that he probably
that feels.
I thought you were about to say
like something he would.
It's
say.
so funny that. So I don't have any favorite. My partner loves them, but that she also had never seen the other ones.
Oh my God!
Phil, I thought you were about to name. I'm like, there is a Beyonce movie that I legitimately would bat for.
I know,
and it's not that.
It is Cadillac Records, right?
I love Cadillac Records. Yeah. I think Cadillac Records is.
I saw your Letterboxd review of it because I'm. Let me tell you, some of these movies aren't easy to find guests for. So you go on Letterboxd and you see who liked what. And I saw that you liked Cadillac Records, and I was like, All right. I've never seen Cadillac Records. I hear it's good.
You know what I think is great about that, Phil, is that you're like, look, some of these films, they're hard to find guests for. I went on Letterboxd, saw you like Cadillac Records. For context, I have not been invited for Cadillac Records. You found someone else.
No. Here's I'm going to say this behind the curtain. This is how it works. The reality is that Emily has reached out to someone for Cadillac Records. Mm-hmm. That person has not gotten back to her. So I am looking for other options. And Mike Natali is at the top of that list right now. So, I mean...
What an incredible way to close out an episode by saying, Mike,
being honest.
I saw your Letterboxd review. Silver medal.
I don't mean it to be shitty. I mean, I'm just, you know how this shit goes, guys. You gotta find guests for your episodes. You do what you gotta do.
Mike, you go sit in the cuck chair. It's fine.
I really didn't mean it in a shitty way. I'm just being honest.
I know. Watch as someone else deals with this movie while you watch from a distance.
I hope.
By the way, I'm convinced that person is never going to get back to Emily, and this is all just a fool's errand.
Phil, I hope they get back to you, and then it turns out they hate the movie, and I have to sit there. I have to sit there listening to this like my own personal Babe Pig in the City. I just have to.
Can I just tell you
stew.
That finding people for episodes on the Fighting Temptations has not been the easiest thing in the world.
Oh man!
But it's been a really fun. Genuinely, it's been a really fun miniseries, and I have to say, and Beehive, whatever. Genuinely enjoying all of Beyonce's performances. She was a legit good actor. She just didn't need it. Like, I get it. Like, I'd just be like, I don't need this, and I'd go be a fucking musician.
Gonna have to rattle the Beehive here and say, no, she wasn't.
So,
go for Tom, not me. Is all I have to say. Yeah.
Phil, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody stick around. At least I'll be back with our picks for the National Film Registry. The Beehive may have come for Tom during the break. Phil, thank you so much. Phil, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much. Everybody else stick around. We'll be right back.
The National Film Registry isn't some fixed object, frozen in time. It's always growing, adding new titles every year. These annual selections are made by the National Film Preservation Board, with members like Martin Scorsese, Alfre Woodard, and Leonard Maltin, and representatives from organizations like the Academy, the DGA, and the AFI coming together to debate and decide. But they don't just pull titles out of thin air. They pull from the public, people like you and us, who can submit their nominations for the registry in a form on the Library of Congress's website. What we do, at the end of each episode, is have Mike and Tom pick films not yet in the registry that they feel should be, inspired by that day's topic. At the end of each season, those films will be formally submitted to the National Film Registry for consideration, on behalf of You're Missing Out. Here are today's picks.
So for my pick, I'm just kind of keeping it simple. We mentioned it in the episode, and I'm picking Dark City. I think that's one of the most underrated movies of the 90s. I think it's maybe not close to the sort of impact and world-building sci-fi stuff that Blade Runner does, but I think it is a necessary pathway to get from a Blade Runner to The Matrix. I think it's dealing with a lot of interesting sci-fi stuff, but in a different angle than Blade Runner does with regards to humanity and our place in the world and all sorts of stuff like that. And I just think the movie's pretty great. There's also the connection to that movie with Blade Runner of having a sort of infamous director's cut that improves upon the original in almost like every conceivable way, with re-editing, scenes out of order, and voiceover stuff and whatnot. I think there is a very strong connection between these two movies, and The Matrix is like 30 seasons from now, and I'm just, let's just get Dark City out of the way. So my pick is Dark City. I think it's a pretty good double feature for Blade Runner, whichever version of Blade Runner you pick.
So for my pick, there are like 5 major science fiction movies that come out in 1982. There is Blade Runner. There's the film we're talking about next season, E.T. There's the film that just got into the registry, Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan. And then there are 2 others that we talked about heavily on this episode, which are John Carpenter's The Thing and Tron. Now, John Carpenter's The Thing is perhaps Tom's favorite film one of his favorite films. And it would feel wrong of me to pick that for the registry. That should be his chance to expound on that. For whatever reason, he keeps missing every opportunity to expound upon that. But nevertheless, I just want to point out, would have been a great time. But I'm not going to talk about The Thing yet. You've got at least the rest of this season. Instead, I do want to talk about Tron. I think, Tom alluded to in our episode, well, the visuals of Blade Runner alone, are an argument for it to be in the registry. That is true of Tron as well. So much of the visual language of Tron has entered the cultural lexicon. The look of the costumes, the light cycles, that whole computer world. And similar to Blade Runner is, of course, about our relationship to machines, as in robots, replicants, things like that. Tron took us inside the computer at a time where most viewers did not have a computer or a computer to have a relationship to. Now we're in a different time. We have that personal connection to so many of our applications, to so many of our devices. Children are being raised with little app-controlled robots with AI that they get sad when the robot shuts down. We're in a much different time, and Tron was very prescient in how we related to our world. It's a marvel of visual effects. It's got such a distinct style. And similar to Blade Runner, it's a deeply influential film that people keep wanting to go back to and explore that world. We alluded to Tron Legacy and the other Tron spin-offs and Tron video games. The world of Tron is fascinating and entrancing. It's another film that bombed in its time but has now become a cult classic. And a film that I think Tron in particular is an important document about our relationship to technology in the early 80s at a fulcrum point between when computers and computer programs were a thing that some people had to think about to being something that is ubiquitous in our lives, So I think there is an important, no pun intended, legacy to Tron that needs to be recognized, and I think Tron deserves a place in the National Film Registry.
Next week,
David Blovband joins us to talk about A Night at the Opera.
But I stand by the idea that I think Night at the Opera is their best film, because I think the gags in it are really funny, funnier than most of the other gags from their other movies.
You're Missing Out is a production of Neon Night Media. It's hosted by Mike Natale and Tom Lorenzo. The show is produced by Kaya Lampar and edited by Mike Natale and Kaya Lampar. More information about our hosts and guests are in the show notes. Thank you to Amanda Rush for our social media, and all of you for checking us out.
If you're listening right now or want to take the show on the go, every episode is available as an audio podcast. Follow You're Missing Out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, please leave a review and a rating. It helps folks find the show.
Want to watch the show or watch some of the films along with us? Great, that's why we're doing this. Don't leave us alone out here. Check out our YouTube channel. We've got video versions of every episode, uploads of some of the National Film Registry titles we're discussing, commentary tracks, and live streams. And once a month, I'll be uploading some content that's exclusive to the YouTube channel. So be sure to click subscribe and hit that little bell to be notified as soon as new stuff goes up. Because, let's be fucking real, I ain't sticking to a goddamn schedule.
So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
And we'll see you next time.
And you'll see us next time. Because we don't watch you, you're watching us.